Zara Williams has been running for 3 months with $800 in cash and a fake ID that cost her last month's food money. But her ex-boyfriend Marcus has private investigator connections everywhere, and tonight in a dingy Seattle motel, she discovers he has found her again. At 24, Zara had believed marketing assistant jobs and corporate presentations would define her future, not this endless flight through bus stations and truck stops across half the country. She was practical, focused, and used to solving problems with spreadsheets and strategy meetings. Her natural hair, woven into protective braids that hung past her shoulders, had once been styled professionally for client meetings. Now the braids served a different purpose, making her harder to identify from a distance, changing her silhouette enough that facial recognition might miss her in crowded terminals. She possessed an athletic build earned from 3 months of constant movement, carrying everything she owned in a single duffel bag, walking miles when she could not afford buses, running when she heard footsteps that sounded too familiar. Her dark eyes, once warm and trusting during her life before Marcus, now stayed alert, scanning every room for exits, every face for recognition, every shadow for threats. She was driven by a single uncompromising vision that kept her moving through exhaustion and fear. Survival, distance, disappearance. The motel room smelled of industrial disinfectant and cigarette residue that decades of cleaning could never quite eliminate. Zara sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, counting the remaining bills for the third time tonight. $237. Enough for maybe 2 more weeks if she ate nothing but convenience store food and kept moving to cheaper places. The fake ID had cost her $400 from a man in Portland who specialized in helping women disappear. Sarah Martinez, the name said. Born in Phoenix. Never lived in Chicago. Never dated Marcus Reed. Her phone buzzed against the nightstand. Unknown number with a Chicago area code. Her blood turned to ice. Zara stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Nobody from Chicago should have this number. She had destroyed her old phone in Denver, bought a prepaid device with cash, given the number to exactly 3 people. The motel clerk for emergencies. A temp agency for potential work. Her grandmother, who promised to never give it out. The phone buzzed again. Same number. She should not answer it. Every instinct screamed danger. But the not knowing felt worse than knowing. So she swiped to accept the call and said nothing. His voice came through clear and cold, exactly as she remembered from the last night she saw him. Hello, baby. Miss me? Marcus Reed. The man who had choked her unconscious in their apartment kitchen. The man who had threatened to bury her where no one would find her when she tried to leave the first time. The man whose private investigator friends had connections in police departments and government agencies and surveillance companies across the country. I know you're in Seattle, baby. I know you're scared. I know you're running low on money. Zara's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. He knew. He knew exactly where she was, exactly how much trouble she was in, exactly how powerless she had become. 3 months of careful movement, of changing her appearance, of using cash only, of sleeping in different places every few nights. All of it useless against whatever resources he was using to track her. You can keep running, Marcus continued, his voice carrying that familiar edge of controlled violence that used to make her flinch. But I've got facial recognition alerts set up in every major city on the West Coast. I've got people checking hostels and cheap motels. I've got your picture circulating among bounty hunters and private security firms. You're not hiding from me, baby. You're just making me work harder to bring you home. The line went dead. Zara sat in the suffocating silence of the motel room, processing the reality that had just crashed into her carefully constructed illusion of safety. Marcus had found her. Not just found the city, but found her current location, her current phone, her current level of desperation. The fake ID meant nothing. The changed appearance meant nothing. The months of careful paranoia meant nothing. She looked around the room that had felt like temporary sanctuary an hour ago, and now felt like a trap. Single window facing the parking lot. Door with a chain lock that would not stop a determined man with tools. Walls thin enough that she could hear the television in the next room, which meant anyone in the next room could hear her moving around. How long did she have? How long before Marcus or the people he hired showed up at this exact door, with this exact room number, ready to drag her back to Chicago and the life she had nearly died escaping? Zara grabbed her duffel bag and started shoving her few possessions inside with shaking hands. 3 pairs of jeans, 5 t-shirts, underwear, socks, toothbrush, and travel-sized shampoo. A jacket that used to be her favorite before it became her only coat. The emergency cash tucked into a hidden pocket. Everything she owned in the world, everything she had become. She could not run forever. The money would run out in weeks, and then what? Sleep in shelters where they required ID and asked questions. Try to find work with a fake identity that might not pass serious background checks. Keep looking over her shoulder. Keep jumping at shadows. Keep waiting for the day Marcus finally cornered her somewhere with no exits and no witnesses. But staying men accepting that Marcus had won. That his threats and his violence and his promise to hunt her down had been more than just angry words spoken in the heat of a fight. Staying meant believing that a man who had once held a knife to her throat while describing exactly how he would kill her if she ever left him was actually capable of following through on those promises. Zara slung the bag over her shoulder and walked to the door. Her hand hesitated on the handle as she forced herself to think tactically instead of just reacting to fear. Where could she go that Marcus would not expect? What options did she have that his private investigators had not already considered? Downtown Seattle. Crowds. Camera-blind spots. Multiple transportation options. If she could get lost among thousands of people, she could buy herself time to figure out the next move. Maybe find a women's shelter that specialized in domestic violence cases. Maybe contact the police, though Marcus had always warned her that he had friends in law enforcement who would tell him if she ever tried to file reports. She opened the door and stepped into the night air, checking the parking lot for unfamiliar vehicles or people who seemed to be watching. Everything looked normal, but normal had stopped meaning safe 3 months ago. Normal was now just the masked danger war while it got closer. Zara walked toward the bus stop 6 blocks away, keeping to the shadows, checking reflections in store windows, listening for footsteps that matched her pace too closely. The city lights stretched out ahead of her like a maze she could disappear into, if she moved fast enough, if she stayed smart enough, if she could outrun the resources of a man who had made finding her his personal obsession. Her heart hammered with each step, but she kept walking. Running was all she knew how to do now. Running was what kept her alive. The Grand Hyatt Seattle rose 34 floors above the downtown district, its glass facade reflecting the city lights like a monument to wealth and power. At nearly midnight, the sidewalks around the luxury hotel remained busy with well-dressed patrons leaving late dinners and business meetings that shaped the city's economy behind closed doors. Expensive cars lined the valet area while uniformed staff moved with the precise efficiency that defined five-star service. Kim Jae-sung emerged from the hotel's main entrance, checking his platinum watch as he descended the marble steps toward the waiting black Mercedes. At 36, he moved with the controlled grace of a man who commanded respect through presence rather than volume, who settled disputes with a glance rather than raised voices. His charcoal suit was cut to perfection by a tailor in Seoul who specialized in clothing that looked conservative from a distance but revealed its astronomical cost through subtle details. The fabric moved like liquid silk, the shoulders fitted precisely to his lean frame, the cut designed to accommodate both business meetings and the shoulder holster he wore beneath the left arm. His face carried the sharp, sculpted features that suggested careful breeding and expensive education. High cheekbones, and a defined jawline that photographers would call aristocratic. Dark hair swept back without a strand out of place despite the long evening of negotiations with shipping contractors and Port Authority officials. His eyes, nearly black in the streetlight, missed nothing as they scanned the area around the hotel entrance, a habit developed through 15 years of building an empire that operated in the spaces between legal and necessary. Kim Jae-sung was the head of Kim Family Operations, legitimate businesses that included import-export warehouses, luxury real estate developments, and shipping contracts that moved goods across the Pacific. The illegitimate operations, known only to those who needed to know, controlled protection territories throughout Seattle's International District, settled disputes for businesses that preferred private arbitration, and ensured that certain cargo containers passed through customs without excessive inspection. He was powerful enough that police commissioners took his calls, wealthy enough that city councilmen attended his dinner parties, and dangerous enough that rival organizations chose negotiation over confrontation. The business meeting had concluded successfully. 3 new shipping contracts secured, 2 potential problems resolved through generous donations to the right charitable organizations. 1 competitor convinced to relocate their operations to Portland rather than challenge Kim family territory. It was nearly midnight, and Jae-sung was mentally reviewing tomorrow's schedule when the woman running down Pine Street crashed directly into his chest. The impact was substantial enough to stagger him backward despite his solid footing. She hit him like someone fleeing for her life, all desperate momentum and panic-driven speed, her duffel bag swinging wide as she tried to catch her balance. For a moment, they stood pressed together on the sidewalk, her hands braced against his suit jacket, her face tilted up toward his in shock and apology. Jae-sung steadied her automatically, his hands closing around her upper arms to keep her from falling. But his attention focused immediately on details that painted a picture he recognized from experience. The way her eyes darted past him to scan the street behind her. The defensive posture even as she apologized, shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The faint tremor in her hands that spoke of adrenaline and sustained fear rather than simple embarrassment at the collision. She was beautiful, even exhausted and obviously terrified. African-American, mid-20s, with natural hair woven into protective braids that had been carefully maintained despite whatever crisis was driving her through downtown Seattle at midnight. Athletic build that suggested someone accustomed to physical activity, though the tension in her frame indicated she had been running from more than exercise. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, worn jeans and a jacket that looked like it had served as her only coat for several months. But it was her eyes that confirmed his initial assessment. Dark brown eyes that stayed alert even while apologizing, eyes that calculated escape routes while maintaining polite conversation, eyes that carried the specific wariness of someone who had learned that safety was temporary and danger could appear without warning. "I'm so sorry," she said, stepping back, but not far enough to break his light grip on her arms. "I wasn't looking where I was going. I didn't mean to knock into you like that." Jae-sung studied her face with the same attention he gave to business negotiations where lives and territories hung in the balance. "You're running from someone," he said quietly. Her response was immediate and rehearsed. "I don't know what you mean. I was just walking fast. Late for a bus." The lie was smoothly delivered but unconvincing to someone who had spent decades reading people's intentions through their tells and hesitations. Jae-sung could see the calculation behind her eyes, the way she was measuring him as a potential threat, while simultaneously recognizing that his expensive suit and obvious wealth marked him as someone who might have resources. "Did he hit you?" Jae-sung asked, his voice dropping to the tone he used for serious conversations that required absolute honesty. Zara's breath caught audibly. The question was too specific, too knowing, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had asked it before under similar circumstances. Her careful composure cracked just enough to reveal the fear she was working so hard to control. "Why would you ask me that?" she whispered. "Because I recognize the signs," Jae-sung replied. "Because you've been looking over your shoulder since before you ran into me. Because you're carrying everything you own in that bag and you're dressed like someone who changes motels every few nights. Because whoever you're running from has resources, or you would have gone to the police already." The assessment was delivered without judgment, simply stating observed facts with the precision of someone accustomed to gathering intelligence quickly and acting on incomplete information. Zara stared at him with growing alarm, not because his words were threatening, but because they were accurate. "I should go," she said, trying to step around him. "Thank you for catching me. Sorry again about running into you." Jae-sung did not physically stop her, but his presence somehow blocked her path without him moving at all. There was something about the way he stood, the controlled intensity that radiated from him like heat, that made her hesitate despite her obvious need to keep moving. "You should go," he agreed, "but not alone, and not on foot." Across Pine Street, near the entrance to a 24-hour pharmacy, 3 men stood scanning the sidewalks with the systematic patience of people conducting a search. One of them was tall, white, wearing the kind of casual clothes that looked expensive from a distance. The other 2 were clearly hired muscle, their attention focused and professional as they checked faces against something one of them held in his hand. Zara followed Jae-sung's gaze and saw them at the exact moment the tall man turned in their direction. Her entire body went rigid with recognition and terror so absolute that Jae-sung felt her trembling before she made a sound. "Oh God," she breathed. "Oh God, he found me. He actually found me." The fear response was immediate and physical. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Blood drained from her face until her dark skin took on a grayish undertone that spoke of shock and panic. She looked like someone who had just seen death walking toward her across a busy street. "Get behind me," Jae-sung said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He stepped between Zara and the street, his body language shifting from polite businessman to something far more dangerous. The change was subtle but unmistakable, visible in the way his shoulders squared, the way his hands moved to positions that suggested weapons training, the way his entire presence suddenly felt like a barrier rather than an obstacle. The tall man across the street had spotted them. He said something to his companions and started walking toward the hotel entrance with the focused determination of someone who had finally located his target. His movement was confident, assured, carrying the entitlement of someone who expected compliance rather than resistance. "Walk into the hotel lobby," Jae-sung instructed quietly, his attention never leaving the approaching men. "Slowly. Act like you belong here. I'll be right behind you." Zara hesitated for one crucial second, torn between accepting help from a stranger and the ingrained fear of trusting anyone with power. But the alternative was facing Marcus and his hired help on a public sidewalk with no protection and no escape route. She walked through the hotel's massive glass doors into a lobby that represented wealth beyond anything she had experienced in months of cheap motels and bus station bathrooms. Marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers. Leather furniture arranged around low tables where businessmen conducted deals worth millions of dollars. The kind of security presence that was invisible but absolute, ensuring that people who did not belong were quietly asked to leave before they could disturb the hotel's exclusive atmosphere. Jae-sung followed her inside, his hand moving to his phone with the casual efficiency of someone placing calls that would be answered immediately regardless of the hour. The hotel staff recognized him with subtle nods and maintained their professional distance while remaining alert to his needs. Behind them, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the three men stopped at the hotel entrance but did not attempt to enter. They stood on the sidewalk looking frustrated and calculating, clearly recognizing that pursuing their target into a luxury hotel with cameras and security would create complications they were not prepared to handle. "You're safe," Jae-sung said quietly, pocketing his phone after a brief conversation conducted entirely in Korean. "They won't follow you in here, but they'll wait. And when you leave, they'll be ready." Zara collapsed into one of the leather chairs, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion and the crushing realization that her 3 months of careful running had bought her nothing except a temporary delay. Marcus had found her. Marcus had brought help. Marcus was prepared to wait as long as necessary to drag her back to the life she had nearly died escaping. "Who are you?" she asked, looking up at the man whose intervention had just saved her from whatever Marcus had planned for this reunion. Jae-sung studied her for a long moment, making calculations about trust and information and the safest way to help someone whose danger had just become his responsibility. "Someone who's dealt with men like your ex-boyfriend before," he said simply, "and someone who has resources they don't." The private conference room on the hotel's 15th floor overlooked Elliott Bay, where cargo ships moved like illuminated cities across the dark water. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Seattle skyline in all its midnight magnificence, towers of glass and steel that represented billions of dollars in commerce and development. The room itself was designed for serious negotiations, equipped with a polished mahogany table that could seat 12, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and technology that ensured complete privacy for conversations that shaped the city's economic landscape. Zara sat across from Kim Jae-sung, overwhelmed by luxury she had not experienced since before Marcus destroyed her life and sent her fleeing across the country with nothing but a duffel bag and terror. The conference room's atmosphere felt like stepping into a different world, one where power was measured in quarterly reports and international shipping contracts rather than the basic survival calculations that had defined her existence for 3 months. Jae-sung had shed his suit jacket, revealing a white dress shirt that was perfectly pressed despite the late hour and the expensive shoulder holster that confirmed her suspicions about his true nature. He sat with the relaxed confidence of someone conducting business in familiar territory, his dark eyes focused entirely on her, as if she represented the most important negotiation of his evening. While she waited, he had made several phone calls in rapid Korean, his tone shifting from polite inquiry to sharp command depending on who answered. One call had been to someone who clearly specialized in research and background investigation. Another had been to security personnel who responded with the immediate efficiency of people accustomed to urgent requests from their employer. "I know about Marcus Reed," Jae-sung said without preamble, sliding a thin folder across the mahogany table. "I know about his private investigator connections, his history of domestic violence, and the $50,000 bounty he's placed on locating you." Zara's heart stopped. $50,000. The amount was so far beyond anything she had imagined that the number felt abstract, impossible, like something from a movie rather than her actual life. But the folder in front of her contained photocopied police reports, employment records, and surveillance photographs that proved Jae-sung's information was accurate and current. "He hired the Petrov brothers," Jae-sung continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing quarterly earnings rather than life-threatening danger. "Russian organization based in Chicago with connections to trafficking and bounty hunting operations. They have resources you cannot hide from indefinitely. Facial recognition software, contacts in law enforcement, and a reputation for never losing a target once the contract is accepted." The fear was immediate and crushing, a cold recognition that everything she had believed about her chances of escape had been naive optimism built on ignorance of how much money and influence Marcus could bring to bear on finding her. $50,000 could buy cooperation from dozens of people, could fund a search operation that covered multiple states, could ensure that every bus station and cheap motel became a potential trap. "You cannot run from this level of resources," Jae-sung stated with the finality of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "You will be found within days, possibly hours. When that happens, Marcus and his associates will not be interested in conversation or negotiation." Zara stared at the folder, seeing her future laid out in surveillance photographs and criminal records, seeing the absolute impossibility of continuing to flee from an enemy who had turned her capture into a professional operation with serious financial backing. "However," Jae-sung continued, "I can offer you an alternative." The word hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in deep water. Zara looked up from the folder to meet his dark eyes, seeing something that might have been genuine concern behind the controlled intensity that seemed to define everything about Kim Jae-sung. "I need a cultural liaison for my import business operations," he said, his tone shifting to the formal cadence of someone making a legitimate business proposal. "Someone who can translate Korean to English in business meetings, handle American business protocols for my associates, and serve as an intermediary when cultural differences create misunderstandings that could jeopardize contracts worth millions of dollars. The salary would be $80,000 per year," he continued, watching her reaction to numbers that represented more money than she had ever imagined earning. "Full health benefits, secure apartment in a building with military-grade security, and new identity documentation that would make Zara Williams disappear from every database that Marcus or his investigators might access. Your responsibilities would include attending business meetings as my cultural consultant, translating both language and business customs, and maintaining absolute discretion about all aspects of my operations, both legitimate and otherwise. You would live in a secured building where residents are protected by surveillance and security personnel who report directly to me." Zara felt her mind struggling to process the offer, the sheer scale of the protection and opportunity being presented like a formal business contract rather than charity or rescue. $80,000 was more than she had earned in her previous job, more than enough to rebuild a life that Marcus could never touch, more than enough to disappear completely from the world where she had spent 3 months running and hiding. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said carefully. "I am asking you to accept employment with Kim Family Enterprises," Jae-sung replied. I am asking you to live under my protection while performing legitimate business services that require your specific skills and cultural background. I am asking for complete loyalty and absolute silence about anything you observe or participate in during the course of your employment. His voice carried a subtle emphasis on the word absolute that suggested consequences for betrayal would be severe and permanent. And if I refuse this offer, Zara asked, then you will leave this hotel, and the Petrov brothers will collect their $50,000 before sunrise, Jae-sung said without emotion. Marcus Reed will have his property returned, and I will continue conducting business as if this conversation never occurred. The statement was delivered with the cold precision of someone laying out contract terms rather than making threats, but the implications were unmistakably clear. This was not a rescue operation or an act of charity. This was a business transaction with specific terms and serious consequences for all parties involved. I don't want to be owned by another man, Zara said, her voice stronger than she felt. I've spent 3 months running from one controlling relationship. I won't walk directly into another one. This is not ownership, Jae-sung corrected. This is employment with security provisions that protect my investment in your training and discretion. You would be free to leave at any time, provided you maintain confidentiality about proprietary information. You would be free to refuse assignments that conflict with your personal values, provided your refusal does not jeopardize existing contracts or ongoing negotiations. However, he continued, his tone hardening slightly, while you remain under my protection and draw salary from Kim Family Enterprises, you will live where I can ensure your safety, work within parameters that protect my business interests, and conduct yourself with the understanding that your actions reflect on my reputation and judgment. Zara processed the offer through the lens of someone who had learned to analyze every interaction for hidden dangers and unspoken obligations. The terms sounded reasonable on their surface, but they also represented a level of dependence on Kim Jae-sung that could easily become another form of captivity if his definition of protection and her definition of freedom proved incompatible. But the alternative was Marcus Reed and the Petrov brothers, and the absolute certainty that running had bought her nothing except a few months of delayed violence. She looked out the conference room windows at the city lights stretching toward mountains she could barely see in the darkness, thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment and the choices that would define everything that happened next. She could accept Jae-sung's offer and trade her independence for safety and financial security. Or she could walk out of this hotel and spend whatever time remained to her looking over her shoulder until Marcus's hired professionals finally cornered her somewhere with no exits and no witnesses. The fear was still there, cold and urgent in her chest, but underneath it was the recognition that Kim Jae-sung represented power that could match or exceed anything Marcus brought against her. His expensive clothes, his casual authority, his ability to research her situation and make phone calls that produced immediate results all suggested someone with resources that $50,000 could not buy or intimidate. If I say yes, she asked quietly, Marcus can never touch me again. Marcus Reed will never touch you again, Jae-sung confirmed, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone making promises he had the power to keep. The bounty will be canceled. The Petrov brothers will be informed that their contract is void. Your ex-boyfriend will be strongly encouraged to direct his attention elsewhere, permanently. There was something in the way he said encouraged that suggested Marcus might not have a choice in the matter, that Kim Jae-sung's methods of persuasion extended beyond financial incentives into territories that most legitimate businessmen avoided. Zara stared at the folder containing her previous life, at the police reports documenting Marcus's violence, at the surveillance photographs proving that running had never been a real option. She thought about the $80,000, about the secured apartment, about the possibility of sleeping through the night without checking locks and planning escape routes. She thought about 3 months of cheap motels and gas station bathrooms, of counting every dollar and calculating how long her remaining money might last, of looking over her shoulder and jumping at shadows, and living with the constant knowledge that Marcus was hunting her with professional help and unlimited patience. She looked across the table at Kim Jae-sung, who waited for her decision with the controlled patience of someone accustomed to negotiations where millions of dollars and human lives hung in the balance. He was dangerous, certainly, involved in activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and necessary. But he was also offering her something Marcus could never take away again. Safety, stability, the chance to rebuild a life from something other than terror and desperation. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. "I accept your offer, Mr. Kim." Jae-sung reached into his jacket and withdrew a phone, sliding it across the table toward her. "Your new number," he said. "The only people who have access to it work for me. When you're ready to begin, call the first contact in the directory." Zara picked up the phone, feeling its weight like a contract signed in her hand, like a bridge burned behind her, like a door closing on 3 months of running and opening onto a future that Marcus Reed could never touch. 6 weeks after accepting Kim Jae-sung's protection, Zara Williams stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse apartment, watching the sunrise paint Elliott Bay in shades of gold and rose that she had forgotten existed during her months of running through gray bus stations and fluorescent-lit motels. The secured luxury building rose 42 floors above downtown Seattle, each floor equipped with surveillance systems and access controls that made unauthorized entry virtually impossible. Her apartment occupied half of the 38th floor, a space designed with the kind of understated elegance that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Hardwood floors in deep walnut stretched beneath furniture that had been selected by someone who understood that comfort and beauty could coexist with the practical requirements of someone who had learned to calculate escape routes automatically. The panic room, accessible through a hidden door in the master bedroom closet, contained communication equipment, emergency supplies, and a secure connection to Jae-sung's security operations that could summon armed assistance within minutes. Zara wore a charcoal wool blazer over a cream silk blouse, the kind of professional wardrobe she had once aspired to afford when her dreams centered on marketing presentations and corporate advancement rather than basic survival. The clothes fit perfectly because Jae-sung had arranged for a personal stylist who specialized in business attire for women who needed to project competence and authority in high-stakes negotiations. The transformation went deeper than expensive clothing. The sleep-deprived exhaustion that had become her default state during 3 months of constant movement had disappeared, replaced by the kind of rest that came from knowing that her safety did not depend on staying alert through every hour of darkness. Her natural hair, still woven in protective braids, now showed the healthy shine that proper nutrition and reduced stress made possible. Her dark eyes, once constantly scanning for threats, had regained some of their former warmth, though they retained the alertness that would probably never fully disappear. At Kim Family Enterprises, she had proven invaluable in ways that surprised even Jae-sung's carefully managed expectations. Her background in marketing translated perfectly to understanding the cultural nuances that could make or break international business relationships. She noticed details that native Korean speakers missed when switching between languages, caught subtle implications that could derail million-dollar shipping contracts, and served as a bridge between American business practices and Korean corporate culture. More importantly, she had demonstrated the kind of discretion that Jae-sung's operations required. She attended meetings where conversations touched on topics that existed in the gray areas between legitimate commerce and necessary influence. She translated discussions about port security arrangements that involved payments to officials who preferred cash transactions. She handled communications with associates whose business cards listed positions in shipping companies, but whose actual responsibilities involved ensuring that certain cargo containers passed through customs without detailed inspection. Zara understood that she was now part of something larger and more complex than simple import-export operations. But she also understood that Jae-sung's empire, whatever its true scope, operated with a code of honor that Marcus Reed and his associates had never recognized. Violence was a last resort rather than a first impulse. Protection was offered to those who earned it through loyalty and competence rather than demanded through fear and intimidation. The evening routine had become something she looked forward to rather than endured. Jae-sung would arrive at her apartment around 8 o'clock, usually carrying ingredients for Korean dishes that he prepared with the focused attention he brought to business negotiations. He remembered details that spoke of genuine care rather than calculated manipulation. The way she preferred jasmine tea to coffee in the evening, her preference for books over television when she wanted to unwind, the fact that she missed painting, which had been her creative outlet before Marcus destroyed her confidence in everything that brought her joy. He had arranged for an art studio in the building's shared spaces, stocked with supplies that probably cost more than her entire apartment deposit during her previous life. When she protested the expense, he replied with characteristic directness that her happiness was an investment in her effectiveness as his cultural liaison. Tonight followed the familiar pattern. Jae-sung arrived with groceries for bulgogi and kimchi fried rice, ingredients that required preparation techniques he had learned from his grandmother during childhood visits to Seoul. They worked together in the kitchen with an easy companionship that had developed gradually over weeks of shared meals and conversation that ranged from business strategies to books they had both read to observations about cultural differences that still surprised them. But as they sat in his private office after dinner, sharing wine from his collection of bottles that represented more than most people spent on cars, Zara noticed something different in his demeanor. He seemed more thoughtful than usual, less focused on the present moment, as if something from his past was demanding attention that he usually devoted to current concerns. "You're thinking about something serious," she observed, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Business problem." Jae-sung swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid catch reflections from the city lights beyond his windows. "Not business," he said quietly. "Family." The word carried weight that suggested complicated history rather than simple nostalgia. Zara had learned during their weeks together that Jae-sung's family background was something he rarely discussed, that his rise to power had involved sacrifices and choices that left him isolated despite his wealth and influence. "I had a younger cousin," he continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone sharing information that still caused pain. "Minji. Sweet, kind, everything good in a world that's mostly dark and calculating. She was studying art history at the University of Washington, planning to become a museum curator, dreaming about traveling to Europe to see paintings she had only studied in textbooks." Zara set down her wine glass, recognizing the setup for a story that would explain something important about the man who had saved her life and given her a future that Marcus could never touch. "She met a man during her senior year," Jae-sung said, his dark eyes focusing on memories that clearly still carried emotional weight. "He seemed nice, polite, well-educated, came from a family with money and connections. He treated her well in public, brought flowers, took her to nice restaurants, talked about marriage and the kind of life they could build together." The past tense and the careful way Jae-sung chose his words told Zara that this story did not have a happy ending, that whatever happened to Minji was connected to the protective behavior he had shown from the moment she crashed into him outside the hotel. "But he wasn't nice," Jae-sung continued. "He was controlling, possessive. He isolated her from friends, monitored her activities, convinced her that his jealousy was proof of love rather than warning of danger. By the time the physical violence started, she was too ashamed and too scared to ask for help from family members who might judge her choices." Zara felt her heart tightening with recognition, hearing her own story reflected in the experience of someone she would never meet, understanding that the parallels between Minji's situation and her own were not coincidental. "I was building this empire then," Jae-sung said, his voice carrying self-recrimination that 6 years had not diminished. Too focused on expanding territory and securing contracts, and proving that Kim family operations could compete with organizations that had been established for generations. "I was traveling constantly, negotiating deals, handling crises that seemed important at the time." He paused, taking a careful sip of wine that seemed designed to buy time rather than satisfy thirst. "Minji called me 3 times during her last month," Jae-sung said. "Left messages saying she needed to talk, that something was wrong, that she could use advice from someone who understood complicated situations. I was in negotiations with shipping contractors in Vancouver. I told myself I would call her back when the deals were concluded, when I had time to focus on family concerns rather than business emergencies." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and permanent consequences that could never be corrected or forgiven. "He killed her on a Tuesday evening in her apartment," Jae-sung said with the flat precision of someone stating facts that had been verified through police reports and private investigation. "Made it look like suicide. Left a note about depression and academic pressure." The police accepted the obvious explanation rather than investigating the bruises that suggested a struggle. Zara reached across the desk and placed her hand over his, feeling the tension in his fingers, understanding why her situation had triggered such immediate protective instincts in a man whose business usually required emotional detachment from other people's problems. I couldn't save her, Jae-sung said, turning his hand palm up to close around hers. I was too busy building power to notice she needed protection from someone who was destroying her from the inside. By the time I understood what had happened, it was too late to do anything except ensure that her killer faced consequences the legal system had decided to ignore. The implication was clear without requiring elaboration. Justice had been served through methods that existed outside courtrooms and legal procedures. But I can save you, Jae-sung continued, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone making promises he had the power to keep. I can use everything I built, all the resources I accumulated while Minji was dying alone, to make sure Marcus Reed never hurts another woman the way his predecessors hurt her. The emotional connection between them shifted in that moment, deepening from gratitude and professional respect into something that acknowledged shared understanding of how quickly safety could disappear and how much courage it took to trust someone with power over your survival. But even as they sat together in the peaceful sanctuary of his office, surrounded by books and expensive wine and the kind of security that money and influence could provide, Jae-sung's phone buzzed with an encrypted message that would change the comfortable rhythm they had established over 6 weeks of growing trust and mutual dependence. He read the message with the careful attention he gave to all intelligence reports, his expression shifting from relaxed warmth to the controlled alertness that had helped him survive 15 years of building an empire that operated in dangerous territories. Marcus has escalated, he said, his tone immediately professional despite the wine and the intimate conversation they had just shared. He's hired Bratva connections from Moscow. They've expanded the search nationwide and increased the bounty to $200,000. The fear response was immediate and physical, even after 6 weeks of safety. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat. The comfortable apartment suddenly felt like an illusion that could be shattered by enemies with resources she had never imagined. Bratva, she repeated, the unfamiliar word carrying implications she did not fully understand but recognized as exponentially more dangerous than anything she had faced during her months of running. Russian organized crime, Jae-sung explained, already reaching for his secure phone to contact security personnel who specialized in threat assessment and tactical response. They have connections to tracking operations, surveillance networks, and enforcement teams that make the Petrov brothers look like amateurs. $200,000 buys cooperation from people who can access government databases, monitor electronic communications, and coordinate search operations across multiple states. The wine glass trembled in Zara's hand as the magnitude of the threat settled over her like cold water. She had spent 6 weeks believing that Kim Jae-sung's protection was absolute, that his resources were sufficient to keep Marcus's violence at a safe distance. But $200,000 represented a level of motivation that could overcome barriers she had thought were impenetrable. How long do we have? She asked. Not long, Jae-sung replied, his attention already shifting to tactical considerations and defensive preparations. But long enough to ensure that when they come for you, they discover that taking something that belongs to me carries consequences they're not prepared to face. The alarm system pierced the midnight silence with a shrill electronic scream that meant someone had breached the building's outer perimeter without authorization. Zara jolted awake in her penthouse bedroom, her heart immediately hammering against her ribs with the kind of terror that 6 weeks of safety had not erased. The sound was not the gentle chime that announced authorized visitors or routine maintenance. This was the harsh warning that meant danger had found its way past multiple layers of security designed to keep Kim Jae-sung's enemies at a safe distance. Emergency lighting activated automatically, casting red shadows across her apartment as blast shields descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows with the heavy mechanical precision of a fortress preparing for siege. The panic room door swung open in response to motion sensors, revealing the cramped but well-equipped space that Jae-sung had insisted was a necessary precaution rather than paranoid preparation. Zara's secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jae-sung's direct line, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone transitioning from protective businessman to something far more dangerous. "They're in the building," he said without preamble. "4 men, armed, heading for your floor. Get to the panic room now, and do not leave until I come for you personally." The fear response was immediate and overwhelming. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she grabbed the emergency bag that contained identification documents, cash, and the kind of supplies that someone might need if they had to disappear quickly and permanently. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Blood drained from her face as the reality crashed over her that Marcus had actually found her, that $200,000 had been sufficient to overcome security measures that had seemed impenetrable just hours ago. "How did they get inside?" she asked, her voice barely steady enough to form words. Later, Jae-sung replied, his attention clearly divided between multiple urgent communications. "Right now, get to safety and let me handle this." Zara ran to the panic room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors, her mind processing the impossibility that Marcus Reed and his hired killers were somewhere in this building, climbing stairs or riding elevators toward her apartment with weapons and intentions that would end her life or drag her back to the hell she had spent months escaping. The panic room sealed automatically once she was inside, layers of reinforced steel and electronic locks engaging with sounds like a bank vault closing. Multiple screens showed camera feeds from throughout the building, revealing the locations and movements of both threats and defenders in real time. Emergency communication equipment provided encrypted connections to Jae-sung's security operations and local law enforcement agencies that had learned to respond quickly to calls from Kim family properties. On the screens, she could see them moving through the building with professional efficiency. Marcus Reed, looking exactly as she remembered except for the expensive tactical vest and the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had backup with serious training and unlimited ammunition. 3 men who moved like soldiers, checking corners and communicating through hand signals, carrying weapons designed for close-quarters combat in urban environments. But she could also see Jae-sung's security team responding with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested extensive training and experience with threats more dangerous than corporate espionage or business disputes. Men emerged from concealed positions throughout the building, armed with equipment that had never appeared on any legitimate business expense report, moving to intercept the intruders before they could reach the upper floors where residents lived and worked. Jae-sung appeared on one of the camera feeds, no longer the carefully dressed businessman who prepared Korean dinners and discussed cultural differences over expensive wine. He had shed his suit jacket and tie, revealing the shoulder holster and the kind of body armor that successful crime bosses wore when handling problems personally rather than delegating them to subordinates. His transformation was complete and terrifying. The controlled intensity that had always defined his presence now focused into something that looked like death walking calmly through corridors lined with marble and original artwork. He moved with the confidence of someone who had survived 15 years of building an empire by ensuring that challenges to his authority were met with overwhelming force and permanent consequences. "Stay here," he said through the panic room's communication system, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone whose orders were never questioned or disobeyed. "I'm ending this." He leaned down to kiss her forehead through the camera's perspective, a gesture that was both tender and final, as if he were saying goodbye before walking into a situation that might not allow for reunion and explanation. The screens went dark. For 20 minutes, Zara sat in the cramped panic room listening to sounds that penetrated even the reinforced walls, shouting in languages she did not recognize, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through elevator shafts and stairwells, heavy footsteps running across floors above and below her location, the kind of mechanical sounds that suggested doors being forced open and barriers being overcome through violence rather than keys. Then silence. The quiet stretched until it felt more threatening than the chaos that had preceded it, until Zara found herself straining to hear any indication that people were still alive somewhere in the building, that the outcome of whatever had just occurred had not left her trapped in a sealed room surrounded by bodies and empty corridors. The communication system crackled to life. "It's over," Jae-sung's voice said, though something in his tone had changed, something that suggested the man speaking was not quite the same person who had kissed her forehead before walking into battle. The panic room opened, and Jae-sung stood in her apartment looking like someone who had just fought a war and won it at considerable cost. His white dress shirt was torn and stained with blood that did not appear to be his own. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled. His knuckles were split and swollen, marked with evidence of hand-to-hand combat that had gone beyond the clinical efficiency of firearms. But it was his eyes that showed the true change. The controlled intensity had been replaced by something colder, more final. The look of someone who had just crossed lines that could never be uncrossed and made decisions that would define how he was remembered by both enemies and allies. Marcus and his associates are no longer operational, he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting the completion of routine business rather than the elimination of human lives. The threat has been permanently removed. Zara stared at him, processing the implications of permanently removed, understanding that the man who had saved her life had just killed 4 people to ensure her safety. The knowledge should have horrified her. 6 months ago, it would have sent her running toward the nearest police station to report multiple homicides and demand protection from the criminal who had committed them. Instead, she felt relief so overwhelming that it made her knees weak. "You killed them," she said, the words coming out as statement rather than question, acknowledgement rather than accusation. "I protected what's mine," Jae-sung replied, moving closer with the careful attention of someone checking for injuries or psychological trauma. His hands, still marked with blood from whatever violence had just occurred in the corridors and stairwells of the building, reached out to touch her face with surprising gentleness. His fingers traced her cheek as if confirming that she was real and safe and still within his protection. Zara did not flinch from his touch. She looked into his dark eyes and saw exactly what Kim Jae-sung was willing to do to keep her safe. Saw the kind of man who built empires through controlled violence and maintained them through the absolute certainty that protecting what belonged to him was worth any cost in blood or conscience. And she accepted it. She accepted him. She leaned into his bloodied hands and kissed him with the desperate gratitude of someone who had just been saved from a death that would have been neither quick nor merciful. Kissed him with the understanding that his darkness was the reason she could continue to exist in the light. Marcus Reed would never hurt anyone again. The Bratva soldiers would never collect their bounty. The threat that had defined her existence for 3 months had been eliminated with the kind of finality that only violence could provide. Zara Williams was finally, completely, permanently safe. And Kim Jae-sung, crime boss and protector, and the most dangerous man she had ever met, belonged to her as completely as she now belonged to him. Dawn broke over Elliott Bay in shades of gold and rose that painted the Seattle skyline like a masterpiece unveiled for the first time. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jae-sung's penthouse office, the city spread below them looked peaceful and orderly, a carefully managed empire where commerce flowed through channels he controlled and protected. The violence of the previous night existed now only in memory and in the subtle changes to building security that would prevent similar breaches from ever occurring again. Zara sat curled in the leather chair across from his desk, wearing one of his dress shirts over sleep shorts, her natural hair freed from its braids and flowing around her shoulders like a crown of soft curls that caught the morning light. She looked younger in the dawn glow, more vulnerable, but also more peaceful than she had appeared during any moment of their 6 weeks together. The constant tension that had defined her posture since the night they met had finally disappeared, replaced by the kind of relaxation that came from knowing that every threat had been permanently eliminated. Jae-sung had showered and changed into fresh clothes, though he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body carried the evidence of recent combat. His knuckles were bandaged where they had connected with bone and concrete during the final confrontation with Marcus and his associates. A bruise darkened his left temple where someone had managed to land a blow before being overwhelmed by his superior training and unlimited motivation. But it was his eyes that showed the true change from the previous night. The cold efficiency that had transformed him into an instrument of lethal violence had softened back into something recognizably human, though with an underlying steel that had not been there before he crossed the line from protection to elimination. They had spent the early morning hours in debriefing conversations with his security team, reviewing footage from the building's surveillance system, and making arrangements for the cleanup and cover story that would satisfy police inquiries about the disturbance reported by neighboring buildings. Marcus Reed and his Broadview associates had officially died in a gang dispute related to territorial conflicts over drug distribution networks, a version of events supported by evidence that had been carefully arranged and witnesses who understood the importance of consistent testimony. Now, as the city woke to another day of legitimate business and ordinary concerns, Jae-sung and Zara sat together in the sanctuary of his office, processing what had changed between them during the night when he killed 4 men to keep her safe. "I need you to understand something," Jae-sung said quietly. His dark eyes focused on her face with the intensity that had marked all their serious conversations. "Last night changed things between us." Zara looked up from the cup of jasmine tea he had prepared while she showered away the terror and adrenaline of hours spent in the panic room. "How did it change things?" she asked. "Before last night, I was protecting an employee," Jae-sung said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone choosing words that would define the rest of their lives together. "Someone valuable to my operations, someone who had proven useful and deserving of the resources I invested in her safety and training." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city where his influence shaped decisions made in boardrooms and back alleys, where his word carried the weight of law in territories that traditional authorities preferred not to patrol too carefully. "But when I saw them hunting you, when I realized they had breached security I believed was absolute, when I understood that Marcus Reed was willing to hire killers to drag you back to the hell you escaped, something changed," he continued. Zara set down her tea and waited, recognizing the tone of someone preparing to share a truth that carried significant emotional weight and permanent consequences. "I stopped thinking about you as an employee I was protecting and started thinking about you as something that belonged to me," Jae-sung said, turning back to face her with the controlled intensity that had defined him from the moment they met. "Something precious enough to kill for. Something I would destroy anyone who tried to take away from me." The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war against anyone who might threaten their connection, like a promise that carried the weight of blood and bone and absolute commitment. "You're mine now," he continued, moving closer with the focused attention of someone claiming something valuable that had been disputed and was now being settled permanently. "Not because you owe me anything, not because you're grateful for protection, but because I need you in ways that have nothing to do with business or cultural liaison work or any of the legitimate reasons I used to justify keeping you close." Zara felt her breath catch as the declaration settled over her like a warm blanket on a cold night, like safety made tangible and absolute. The possessive claim should have triggered her defensive instincts, should have reminded her of Marcus's controlling behavior and violent jealousy. Instead, it felt like coming home after months of being lost and afraid. "I'm yours," she replied, standing to close the distance between them until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, until she could feel the controlled strength in his presence that had eliminated every threat to her happiness and survival. "And you're mine," she continued, reaching up to touch the bruise on his temple, the physical evidence that he had fought personally to keep her safe rather than delegating her protection to subordinates and maintaining his own distance from violence. "Mine, broken pieces and all," she whispered against his lips as he pulled her into an embrace that felt like claiming and being claimed simultaneously, like two people who had found in each other something worth fighting and killing and dying for. The kiss was desperate and grateful and hungry, months of careful professional distance giving way to the recognition that they had moved far beyond employer and employee into territory that required different words and different promises. "Forever," Jae-sung breathed against her mouth, his hands framing her face as if she were something precious that might disappear if he did not hold her carefully enough. "Forever," Zara agreed, and felt the last of her fear disappear into the certainty that Kim Jae-sung would never let anyone hurt what belonged to him. Later, as the morning moved toward afternoon and the city resumed its normal rhythm of commerce and routine concerns, they sat together on his office couch, discussing futures that no longer included the possibility of running or hiding or looking over shoulders for threats that would never materialize. "Marry me," Jae-sung said without preamble, his tone carrying the same directness he brought to business negotiations where millions of dollars depended on clear communication and unambiguous terms. The proposal was delivered with characteristic efficiency, but Zara could see the vulnerability underneath the controlled presentation, could recognize that this was not a business arrangement, but a man asking someone he loved to share a life he had built through violence and ambition and careful attention to protecting what mattered most. "Be my wife," he continued, reaching into his desk drawer to withdraw a ring that had clearly been selected with the same attention to detail he brought to all important acquisitions. "Let me protect you for the rest of our lives. Let me give you everything I built, everything I accumulated, everything I became." The ring was platinum and diamonds, elegant rather than ostentatious, designed for someone who understood that true wealth was displayed through quality rather than size. It represented more money than Zara had ever imagined owning. But more importantly, it represented the promise that she would never again face danger alone. "Yes," she said without hesitation, extending her hand so he could slide the ring onto her finger with the careful precision that characterized everything he did when the outcome mattered to him personally. The legal arrangements would ensure her financial independence even if something happened to him, he explained, his practical nature asserting itself even during the proposal. New identity documents that would make her previous life completely untraceable. Ownership stakes in legitimate businesses that would provide income and security regardless of what happened to the more questionable aspects of his empire. But more than financial protection, he was offering her a partnership in building something that would outlast both of them, something that would transform the violence and ambition of his past into a legacy that could protect other women who found themselves in the kind of danger she had escaped with his help. "I want to create a foundation," he said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had found purpose beyond simple accumulation of power and wealth. "Resources for women fleeing domestic violence. Safe houses that can't be found or breached. Legal assistance from attorneys who specialize in helping people disappear when staying visible means staying vulnerable." Zara looked at the ring on her finger, then at the man who had killed to keep her safe, understanding that their marriage would be built on the foundation of his darkness serving her light, his violence protecting her peace, his empire ensuring her freedom. 6 months ago, she had believed marketing presentations and corporate advancement would define her future. 3 months ago, she had run through the night with $237 and the desperate hope that distance and careful planning might keep her ahead of Marcus Reed's determination to drag her back to captivity. Now she sat in a penthouse office overlooking a city where her husband's word carried the weight of law, wearing a ring that represented more wealth than most people saw in a lifetime, planning a foundation that would use the resources he had accumulated through careful violence to save women from the kind of danger she would never face again. Marcus Reed was dead, eliminated permanently along with anyone who might continue his work. The Bratva connections had been severed through methods that ensured no future contracts would be accepted. The bounty had been canceled not through negotiation, but through the kind of demonstration that made clear what happened to people who threatened Kim family interests. Zara Williams, who had once counted every dollar and calculated how many days her remaining money might last, now stood beside her husband as he handled phone calls about shipping contracts worth millions of dollars and real estate developments that would reshape neighborhoods according to his vision and preferences. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer afraid. She was Mrs. Kim Zara, wife of the most dangerous man in Seattle, protected by resources that Marcus Reed had never imagined existed, cherished by someone who had proven his devotion through actions that spoke louder than any words or promises. And when she looked back at the terrified woman who had crashed into Jae-sung's chest outside a luxury hotel while fleeing killers hired by her ex-boyfriend, she could barely recognize herself in someone who had believed survival was the best future she could hope for. Now, planning their honeymoon trip to Seoul, where she would meet the family members who had helped build the empire that protected her, discussing the foundation that would help other women escape the kind of hell she had lived through, wearing a wedding ring that represented absolute security and unlimited devotion, Zara understood that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected directions. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room was exactly who you needed him to be.